December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. A German artillery shell tears through the frozen sky and detonates inside an American command post, vaporizing 3 officers where they stand. Their coffee cups are still warm on the table, their maps still pinned to the wall. 1 second they are planning the next Allied advance into Germany. The next second they are gone. Flesh bone and strategy reduced to smoke and silence in the Ardennes forest. That same morning, across an 80-mile front stretching through Belgium and Luxembourg, over 200,000 German soldiers surge forward out of the frozen darkness. They come with 1,000 tanks. They come with artillery that shakes the ground for miles in every direction. They come with the specific cold intention of splitting the Allied armies in two, driving to the sea, and strangling the supply lines that have been feeding the American war machine since Normandy. American units along that front are shattered within hours. Some divisions lose contact with headquarters entirely. Runners sent with messages never return. Radio operators transmit into static. Men who went to sleep as part of a functioning army wake up surrounded, cut off, outnumbered, and fighting for their lives in weather so savage that frostbite claims fingers and ears before the Germans even arrive. Within 48 hours, the situation becomes a nightmare wearing a uniform. And somewhere inside that nightmare, at the crossroads town of Bastogne, Belgium, 11,000 American soldiers are about to be completely encircled by an enemy force that outnumbers them 4-1. No food, dwindling ammunition, no air support, no relief column. Temperatures dropping below zero every night. And the man who will save them is standing in a freezing conference room in Verdun, France, about to make a promise so audacious that the most powerful Allied generals in Europe burst out laughing. His name is George S. Patton, and what he says in the next 60 seconds will either become the most brilliant military move of World War II or the most catastrophic promise ever made by an American general. This is the story of how he kept that promise. And this is the story of what Omar Bradley said afterward. Words so stunning, so private, so completely out of character for the most measured man in the Allied command that military historians still quote them today as the highest praise one general ever gave another. To understand why those words carry such weight, you have to understand where the Allied command was mentally on December 19, 1944. 3 days into the German offensive. 3 days of watching the situation maps get worse with every briefing. 3 days of phone calls that began with bad news and ended with worse news. Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, had over 1 million men under his authority. He was methodical, careful, a man who read reconnaissance reports 3 times before drawing conclusions. He had grown up the son of a poor Missouri farmer, earned his way to West Point through sheer academic discipline, and built a reputation in the Army not on flash or fury, but on quiet competence and steady judgment. Bradley was the kind of general who made you feel safe. He didn't gamble. He didn't perform. He planned, he executed, and he won. And in the 3 days since the Germans launched what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Bradley had watched his careful plans dissolve like paper in rain. The Ardennes sector had been considered a quiet zone, a rest area for divisions recovering from heavy combat, a training ground for green units learning war before being thrown into the serious fighting. The terrain was dense forest and broken hills, and Allied intelligence had labeled it unsuitable for a major German armored offensive. Too narrow, too wooded, too difficult for tanks. That assessment was catastrophically wrong. The Germans had masked an entire army group in those forests for weeks. They moved at night. They maintained strict radio silence. They used horse-drawn vehicles in forward areas to avoid the engine noise that American reconnaissance aircraft would detect. And when they came with everything: the desperation of a nation bleeding dry and the tactical genius of commanders who had nothing left to lose. Bradley had placed thinly stretched American units along that front. 2 divisions covering a front that should have held 4 or 5. He had believed the assessments. He had trusted the intelligence. And now those decisions sat on his shoulders like a physical weight as he stared at situation maps showing German arrows driving deeper and deeper into the Allied rear. The town of Bastogne sits at the center of 7 major road networks in the Ardennes. 7 roads converging at a single point, like the spokes of a wheel. Control Bastogne, and you control movement through the entire region. Lose it, and the German advance can fan out west and north without logistical constraint, flowing like water through a broken dam. The 101st Airborne Division had been rushed to Bastogne in trucks, arriving just before the German ring closed. They were paratroopers, elite soldiers trained for exactly the kind of isolated, surrounded, outnumbered combat they were now being handed. But they were paratroopers without the supplies they needed. Many had left their rear areas so quickly, they arrived with incomplete equipment, scattered gear, and no real idea yet of how completely they were about to be cut off. By December 19th, the ring around Bastogne is sealed. The Germans surround the town with multiple divisions. Armored spearheads to the west keep pushing toward the Meuse River. Infantry holds the encirclement. Artillery shells Bastogne around the clock. The defenders dig into frozen ground that resists shovels like concrete, and they count their remaining ammunition with the focused attention of men who understand that each shell represents a minute of continued survival. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commands inside the perimeter. He is calm. He is professional. He radiates a certainty he has no material basis for because that is what the situation requires. His men can hear German armor moving in the darkness beyond their lines. They can feel the ground shake when German artillery fires. They can count the supply containers that remain. They cannot know that 70 miles to the south a plan is forming that will reach them. They cannot know the name of the man who is already in the early hours of December 19th, ordering his staff to prepare movement orders for an operation that has not yet been authorized for an attack, that has not yet been ordered for a rescue mission, that his fellow generals do not yet believe is possible. Patton had commanded 3rd Army since August 1944, and in 4 months, he had driven across France faster than any army in history. He was impulsive in conversation and precise in execution. He gave speeches that made men feel invincible, and then backed those speeches with planning so thorough it made the invincibility real. He was not beloved the way Bradley was beloved. He was feared, admired, resented, and followed. He had already been in trouble. The slapping incidents in Sicily, where he struck hospitalized soldiers he accused of cowardice, had nearly ended his career. He had commanded from the shadows, while other generals received credit for operations his armies made possible. He arrived in France, late restricted, watched. And then he was unleashed, and he moved like a man who understood that every day of war wasted was a day of lives wasted. When Bradley called him on the night of December 18th and ordered the 10th Armored Division sent north to help stabilize the crisis, Patton's initial reaction was fury. His own offensive eastward into Germany was building momentum. Pulling a division now would stall everything. Weeks of casualties, weeks of grinding combat wasted. He argued. Bradley did not yield. "The North is collapsing," Bradley told him. "If it collapses fully, nothing else matters." Patton gave in. But he did not stop thinking. After the call, he sat with his intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, who had been warning for weeks that German strength was building opposite the Ardennes. Patton had dismissed the threat as peripheral to his own axis of advance. Now Koch's warnings were written in fire across the entire Allied front. Patton made a decision that separated him from every other senior commander in that moment. Instead of treating the German offensive purely as a crisis demanding a defensive response, he looked at it as a shape. An exposed flank. An overextended enemy spearhead driving west, with its southern side open, vulnerable, begging to be hit. He called in his staff that night. He told them Eisenhower would summon senior commanders to Verdun in the morning, and that Eisenhower would almost certainly order 3rd Army to turn north and strike into the German flank. The officers looked at each other with expressions that blended disbelief and professional dread. Turn north. 3rd Army was already engaged. Turning 250,000 men and their vehicles 90 degrees while maintaining combat effectiveness was not a standard staff exercise. It was the kind of maneuver that existed in theory and failed in practice, Roads would jam, supply lines would snap, units would lose coordination. The whole thing would arrive late, exhausted, and disorganized. Patton did not ask whether it could be done. He ordered 3 plans. An attack north with 3 divisions, another with 4, another with 6. He wanted movement orders drafted for all 3 options and ready before the Verdun conference began. His staff worked through the night. They spread maps across every available surface. They traced road networks with pencils and calculated fuel requirements by lamplight. They figured out how to redirect supply dumps built for eastward operations, how to shift artillery battalions from one firing sector to another, how to keep signal networks functioning while the entire army changed direction. By morning, the plans existed, not as theoretical possibilities, as actual orders waiting for authorization. At 11 o'clock on December 19, 1944, the commanders assemble in Verdun. The room is cold enough that breath is visible. Eisenhower opens the meeting by declaring that the current situation is an opportunity, not a disaster. Some men in the room think he has lost his grip on reality. Outside, the German offensive has driven a bulge into the Allied line that looks on the map like a fist pushing through fabric. Eisenhower points to Bastogne. He explains what losing it means. He turns to Patton. How soon can you attack north with a substantial force? Patton stands. He walks to the map. His voice is flat and without theater. He says he can attack with 3 divisions on December 22nd. 48 hours. The room erupts. Not in applause, in laughter. Skeptical, tight, involuntary laughter from men who understand the mathematics of moving armies and believe those mathematics make Patton's statement impossible. British officers exchange glances. American commanders shift in their chairs. Bradley stares at his old friend and feels the pull of doubt stronger than almost any professional moment he can remember. He knows Patton. He knows the famous bravado. He knows the speeches. He also knows that Patton does not stake his reputation on operations he privately believes will fail, not when men will die to prove him wrong. Eisenhower presses him. When can you start? Patton names the units. 4th Armored Division, 26th Infantry Division, 80th Infantry Division, 3 divisions, ready to move, ready to fight. His staff has the movement orders. Units are standing by. Bradley's chief of staff leans over and whispers that Patton must be bluffing. There is no way. But somewhere in Bradley's chest, underneath the doubt, a different calculation is forming. A quiet, reluctant, growing recognition that the man standing at the map with absolute certainty has spent the last 12 hours doing what no one else thought to do. As the conference breaks, Bradley pulls Patton aside. The warning is personal and direct. George, you had better deliver. The entire Allied command just heard you promise the impossible. Patton looks at him without hesitation. I will be in Bastogne by Christmas. Bradley watches him walk away and feels something he cannot fully name yet. Something between terror and awe. Something that in the days that follow, as Third Army begins to move with a speed and coherence that defies every expectation, will slowly transform into the most genuine professional admiration he has ever felt for another soldier. What happens next will require those 3 divisions to cover over 100 miles in winter, pivot from one direction of march to another, and fight through prepared German defenses in weather that grounds aircraft and freezes engines. It will require leadership at every level to function under conditions that would justify failure. It will require soldiers to keep moving when their bodies demand stillness and their training demands caution. And it will result in one moment, late in the afternoon of December 26, 1944, when a column of American Sherman tanks approaches the Bastogne perimeter from the south, and the men who have been surrounded for a week, who have been counting bullets and bandages, and days finally see friendly armor coming through the tree line. But before that moment arrives, Third Army has to turn. And what happens when an army of 250,000 men attempts to change direction in 48 hours in winter, under fire on frozen roads that were never designed for this weight of traffic, is a story that belongs entirely to the men who made it happen. Part 2 begins with the first convoy moving north in the darkness and the first sign that George Patton has either just saved the 101st Airborne or just handed the Germans the most spectacular American failure of the entire war. In 48 hours, George Patton promised to turn 250,000 men and their machines 90 degrees in the worst winter in decades and drive north into the teeth of a German offensive that had already shattered 3 American divisions. The Allied High Command laughed. Bradley told him he had better deliver. And as Part 1 ended, the first convoys were beginning to move north in the darkness, headlights off engines straining against frozen roads, carrying the weight of a promise that had no business being kept. But here is what the history books gloss over. Moving Third Army was only half the problem. The other half was fighting through a German defensive line south of Bastogne that had been specifically designed in the hours after the Verdun Conference to stop exactly what Patton was attempting. Because German intelligence was not blind. They knew Third Army was turning. They knew what a relief column from the south would mean for their timetable, and they had given orders to make sure it never arrived. By December 21, 1944, the German units holding the southern approach to Bastogne had constructed a defensive belt across the primary axis of Patton's advance that military analysts would later describe as one of the most tactically efficient blocking positions of the entire Western campaign. Anti-tank guns sighted on frozen ridgelines. Infantry dug into positions using the terrain like a natural fortress. Every road approach covered by interlocking fields of fire. Villages converted into strongpoints, where a single determined squad with a machine gun could stop an armored column for hours. Patton's 4th Armored Division hit that line on December 22nd, exactly as he had promised. And it did not go through it, it ground into it. The problem was immediate and brutal. Lieutenant General Manton Eddy, commanding 12th Corps under Patton, had serious reservations about the pace Patton was demanding. Eddy was a competent, experienced commander, not a fool, not a coward. But he understood attrition in a way Patton sometimes refused to. On the afternoon of December 22nd, Eddy called Patton directly. "George," he said, "if I push Combat Command B the way you're asking, I'm going to burn through their tank strength before they get within 5 miles of Bastogne. I need time to bring up the artillery properly. I need the flanks secured before the spearhead advances further." Patton's response was short and left no room for discussion. "Manton, I don't want to hear about flanks. The men inside Bastogne don't have time for your flanks. You push and you push now." Eddy pushed, and the cost was immediate. In the first 24 hours of fighting south of Bastogne, the 4th Armored lost 33 tanks to German anti-tank fire mechanical failure on frozen roads and close-quarters combat in villages where armor without infantry support was nearly helpless. 33 tanks in a single day represented a significant fraction of the division's operational strength. At that rate of attrition, the relief column would destroy itself before it reached the perimeter. By December 23rd, senior officers in Eisenhower's headquarters were beginning to quietly calculate whether Patton's promise was turning into exactly the kind of catastrophe the room at Verdun had feared. 3 days in. Progress measured in miles rather than the distances required. German resistance stiffening rather than cracking. And inside Bastogne, the defenders were now completely out of artillery ammunition for certain calibers, running critically low on medical supplies and treating wounded men in conditions that a veterinarian would have considered inadequate. Patton knew the numbers. He received the situation reports every few hours. He read them with the specific focus of a man who has publicly committed himself to an outcome and is watching the gap between promise and reality widen with every passing hour. But he also understood something that the casualty reports did not capture. The 4th Armored was advancing on a single axis. One road, one direction. Predictable. The Germans could concentrate everything they had against a threat that was coming straight at them. What the attack needed was not more weight on the same line. It needed a different shape. He found his unexpected ally in Brigadier General Herbert Ernest, commanding Combat Command Reserve of the 4th Armored. Ernest was the kind of officer who thought in terrain rather than in doctrine. He had studied the road network south of Bastogne on the maps and noticed something that the primary operational plan had not exploited. There was a secondary route, a narrow road running through the village of Assenois that approached the Bastogne perimeter from a slightly different angle. It was not on the main axis. It was not the route anyone had reinforced or defended against. Ernest went to Patton on the evening of December 25th, Christmas night, and made the proposal directly. Send a smaller, faster task force down the Assenois road. Not a full combat command. A task force. Tanks and armored infantry together, moving fast enough to get through before the Germans could respond. The larger attack on the main axis would continue as a fixing force holding German attention and reserves in place, while the secondary thrust found the gap. Patton looked at the map for approximately 30 seconds. Then he looked at Ernest. "Do it," he said, "and do it tomorrow." Ernest built the task force around Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion and elements of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, placing Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams in command. Abrams was 29 years old. He commanded from the front. His soldiers would later describe him using words that belonged to mythology rather than personnel evaluations: relentless, fearless, present in exactly the place where presence mattered most. December 26, 1944. The sky had cleared the day before, and Allied aircraft had finally been able to reach the battlefield, hammering German positions and dropping supply bundles into Bastogne. The defenders inside the perimeter had received ammunition rations and the knowledge that they had not been forgotten. Morale had recovered from its lowest point. But the siege was not broken. The perimeter held, but it held by arithmetic, counting what remained and calculating how many hours those remaining supplies could sustain combat. At approximately 1400 on December 26th, Abrams moved. The column surged north from the line of departure with an aggression that left no room for hesitation. Sherman tanks rolling hard on a road that had not seen American armor before. The element of surprise held for the first mile. Then, German anti-tank guns opened fire from positions covering the Assenois road, and the column took immediate hits. 2 tanks stopped, not destroyed, but disabled, blocking the road behind them. Abrams made the decision in seconds. Go around them. Armored infantry dismounted and pushed the disabled vehicles physically to the roadside while under fire. Abrams kept the column moving. The tank behind him fired continuously at suspected gun positions in the tree line, suppressing, rather than aiming, covering the forward movement with noise and steel. The village of Assenois appeared ahead. German defenders had occupied the buildings, and as the column entered the village, the fight became something that no training exercise could replicate. Tanks fired at point-blank range into walls and windows. Infantry cleared houses room by room, pulling defenders from cellars and upper floors, while the column behind them kept pressing through. The noise was total, overwhelming, a physical sensation rather than merely a sound. Through Assenois, out the other side. The road ahead stretched north toward the Bastogne perimeter. 4 miles, then 3, then 2. German fire continued from the flanks, raking the column as it moved. 2 more tanks took hits. The column did not stop. Abrams radioed ahead, attempting to coordinate recognition with the defenders on the perimeter so that the approaching American armor would not be engaged by the men it was coming to relieve. At 1650, on December 26, 1944, the lead tank of Abrams' task force approached the American defensive perimeter south of Bastogne. An identification panel was displayed. Engineers and paratroopers on the line, men who had been holding that perimeter for 7 days on dwindling everything, recognized what they were seeing. American armor, friendly, from the south, exactly where no tank had been for a week. The word spread through Bastogne faster than any radio message could carry it. Not through official channels, through something more immediate. One soldier telling another, a voice shouting down a foxhole, a runner sprinting between positions. The ring was cracked. They were no longer alone. Within 3 hours, supply convoys began entering the town through the Assenois corridor. Trucks carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food. Wounded men who had been lying in inadequate aid stations for days. Men who had been waiting for evacuation that could not come while the siege held, began moving south through the corridor toward proper hospitals. The mathematics of survival inside Bastogne changed in a single afternoon from depletion to replenishment. When Bradley received confirmation that Patton had broken through, the reaction in his headquarters was not the controlled professional acknowledgement of an expected outcome. It was something rawer than that. Officers who had been running on coffee and anxiety for a week stood at the situation maps and simply looked at each other. The line had been drawn. The corridor was open. The 101st Airborne had held, and Third Army had reached them in 7 days from the moment Patton stood up in that cold room at Verdun and made a promise that the room believed was impossible. Bradley called Patton personally. The conversation was brief. "Congratulations." Then something that Bradley rarely offered to anyone, an acknowledgement that what had just happened exceeded his expectations by a margin he could not quantify. The Army had moved. The Army had fought. The Army had arrived with enough coherence to punch through prepared German defenses. That combination, mobility and fighting effectiveness, maintained simultaneously, was not something Bradley had believed Third Army could achieve at that pace in those conditions. He was wrong, and Bradley was a man honest enough to know when he was wrong. But here is where the story takes a turn that no one inside Bastogne or Patton's headquarters anticipated. The corridor that Abrams had torn open through Ardennes was narrow. 4 miles of road under German observation, exposed on both sides to enemy forces that had not been destroyed, merely bypassed. Supply convoys running that corridor were moving through a passage that German artillery could close, and close quickly, if German command made the decision to concentrate fire on it. On December 27th, German artillery began doing exactly that. 3 supply trucks were destroyed in the Ardennes corridor in a single hour on the morning of December 27th. The drivers who survived described running the route as something equivalent to driving through an ongoing bombardment with no possibility of cover. German commanders had recovered from the shock of the breakthrough fast enough to recognize that killing the corridor was more valuable than maintaining the encirclement. Bastogne was no longer sealed, but it could be strangled again if the corridor became impassable. At the same time, German armored forces launched a counterattack against the flanks of Patton's penetration, exactly the vulnerability that Eddie had warned about before the attack began. 2 German divisions struck the eastern flank of the corridor on December 27th, with the specific aim of cutting the supply line and re-isolating Bastogne. The 4th Armored, which had just completed one of the most demanding operations of its existence, now had to hold what it had gained against an enemy that was not finished. The relief of Bastogne, it turned out, was not an ending. It was a transition point. The battle had moved from a German offensive into something more complicated, a grinding, costly, multi-directional struggle across frozen terrain, where the question was no longer whether Bastogne would fall, but whether the Allied position in the Ardennes could be consolidated before German forces found another way to exploit the chaos they had created. Patton understood this instantly. He began realigning Third Army's strength not to celebrate the breakthrough, but to defend it and widen it. Additional divisions moved into the Bastogne sector. The corridor was reinforced. Artillery positioned to cover the supply routes. Engineers worked to improve the roads under German fire. And somewhere in that reorganization, in the constant movement and counter-movement of armies across frozen Belgium, German intelligence began circulating a document through their command network that would reach American hands within 72 hours. A document that revealed something critical about German intentions for the next phase of the Ardennes offensive. Something that made the breakthrough at Bastogne look, in hindsight, like the opening move of a much larger game. What was in that document, what it revealed about what the Germans were planning next, and why it forced Patton to make a second decision as audacious as his promise at Verdun, is exactly what Part 3 is about. Because the Battle of the Bulge was not over. It had just changed shape. And the man who would have to respond to its new shape was the same man who had already done the impossible once. The question now was whether lightning could strike twice in the same frozen forest. Patton had broken through to Bastogne. Third Army had turned 90 degrees in 48 hours, fought through prepared German defenses in winter, and torn open the siege that most Allied commanders believed would end in surrender. The corridor through Arsenois was open. Supply convoys were moving. The 101st Airborne was no longer alone. Part 2 ended with German artillery beginning to hammer that corridor, and German armor striking the flanks of Patton's penetration with everything available. The question was no longer whether Bastogne could be saved. The question was whether what Patton had built could survive what was coming next. Here is the number that explains the next 72 hours. On December 27, 1944, German forces launched 9 separate counterattacks against the Bastogne corridor and its flanks. 9. In a single day. The German command had recognized with cold clarity that Bastogne had become the symbolic center of the entire Ardennes offensive, and that allowing the American relief to stand unchallenged was operationally and psychologically unacceptable. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, had read the situation correctly. If the corridor held and widened, the entire southern flank of the German offensive would become exposed to a Third Army that had already demonstrated it could move faster and hit harder than anyone anticipated. Model needed the corridor closed. He needed it closed immediately. And he was willing to spend men and armor to close it in a way that German logistics, already stretched to breaking point, could not actually afford. The counterattacks on December 27th were fierce, coordinated, and partially successful. 2 sections of the Arsenois corridor came under artillery fire so concentrated that supply convoys were halted for several hours. Armored infantry, holding the eastern flank of the penetration, were pushed back several hundred yards before stabilizing. German panzer units probed for weak points in the 4th Armored's extended line, looking for the gap that would let them cut behind the spearhead and sever it from its supply base. Patton received the reports and made adjustments that same day, shifting reserves, repositioning artillery, ordering Combat Command A of the 4th Armored to reinforce the flank that was under the heaviest pressure. But inside his own command structure, a different kind of pressure was building, quieter than artillery fire, more corrosive than tank rounds, and in some ways more dangerous than anything the Germans were doing. Major General Hugh Gaffey, commanding the 4th Armored Division, requested a meeting with Patton on the evening of December 27th. Gaffey was direct. His division had been in continuous combat for 6 days. Tank strength was down to 60% of operational capacity. Crew fatigue was at a level where reaction times were degrading and judgment was becoming unreliable. He needed 48 hours to consolidate repair vehicles, rotate crews, and resupply properly before the division could sustain another major operation. Patton looked at him for a long moment. "How many men are in Bastogne right now who haven't slept in a week?" he asked. Gaffey said nothing. 48 hours, Patton said. "I'll give you 24. Use them well." The exchange captured exactly the tension running through Third Army in those final days of December. The machine that Patton had built and driven at maximum speed for 6 days was showing the strain that maximum speed always produces. Equipment that had been pushed beyond maintenance intervals was beginning to fail. Supply lines that had been rerouted, extended, and improvised were developing gaps. Units that had performed extraordinary maneuvers were running on diminishing reserves of physical and psychological endurance. On December 28th, an ammunition convoy moving through the Arsenois corridor struck a mine and blocked the road for 4 hours during a period when German artillery was also active. 11 vehicles were damaged or destroyed. The corridor was passable but barely, and the reports reaching Eisenhower's headquarters began to include cautious language about whether the Bastogne position could be adequately sustained through a narrow passage under continuous German pressure. There were voices at Eisenhower's headquarters, careful and measured voices, that began suggesting the Bastogne salient might be more defensible if contracted rather than expanded. If the corridor was maintained at minimum width, if Third Army focused on holding what it had rather than pushing to widen the penetration, the supply situation might stabilize without further costly offensive action. Patton read the summary of those discussions and understood their logic and rejected it completely. A narrow corridor was a fragile corridor. The Germans had already demonstrated they could interdict it with artillery. The only solution was width. More roads, more access routes. A penetration so broad that no concentration of German artillery could close all of it simultaneously. Contracting the salient was not consolidation. It was slow surrender dressed in operational language. He was right. And the event that proved him right came on January 3, 1945. German Army Group B launched what would become the final major German offensive thrust of the Ardennes campaign on January 3, striking northwest of Bastogne, with 2 panzer divisions and 3 infantry divisions in a coordinated assault designed to cut the American corridor once and for all. The attack came in the pre-dawn darkness, preceded by an artillery preparation that survivors described as the heaviest sustained bombardment they had experienced since the opening days of the Bulge itself. The German commanders had chosen their axis of attack carefully. They hit the junction between 2 American units, the boundary area where coordination is always most difficult and response is always slowest. In the first hour of the attack, German armor penetrated more than a mile into the American position. Infantry following the tanks moved to exploit the gap before defenders could reorganize. Radio communications in the struck sector collapsed under the bombardment, leaving company and battalion commanders without higher headquarters contact at exactly the moment they needed it most. For approximately 90 minutes on January 3rd, the German attack was succeeding. Patton was at his command post when the first coherent reports arrived. He had a map. He had a phone. He had artillery already positioned in depth behind the penetrated sector. He issued 3 orders in rapid sequence. Artillery fire on the German axis of advance continuous maximum rate. Combat Command Reserve of the 4th Armored, which had been his operational reserve, moving immediately to seal the penetration from the south. And the 6th Armored Division, which had just completed movement into the Bastogne area, attacking into the northern flank of the German penetration before the enemy could consolidate the ground he had taken. The sequence of responses landed on the German attack within 2 hours of its initiation. American artillery fell on the advancing German columns with a density that survivors described as walking into a wall. The German tanks that had penetrated the line found themselves ahead of their infantry, which had been stopped by fire, and then found American armor coming at them from 2 directions simultaneously. The battle that followed was not elegant. It was close, confused, brutal fighting across terrain that favored neither side in temperatures that caused casualties independently of enemy action in visibility, so poor that tank commanders frequently could not identify targets at ranges greater than 200 yards. German anti-tank guns destroyed American tanks at close range. American artillery destroyed German infantry in the open. Armored vehicles from both sides maneuvered on roads so icy that tracks spun without purchase and drivers lost control on curves that would have been trivial in summer. By midday on January 3rd, the German penetration had been contained. By late afternoon, it was being reversed. By nightfall, German forces were withdrawing from the ground they had taken in the pre-dawn assault, leaving behind 41 tanks destroyed or abandoned, and an estimated 800 soldiers killed or captured in a single day of fighting. The breakthrough that model had ordered the attack that was supposed to finally close the Bastogne corridor and demonstrate that the German offensive still had operational momentum had been absorbed, stopped, and thrown back in less than 12 hours. Inside German Army Group B headquarters that night, the after-action assessment was written in language that military professionals use when they need to record failure, without assigning blame in ways that end careers. The assessment noted that American response times had been faster than anticipated, that American artillery coordination had been more effective than the attack planning had assumed, that American armored reserves had been positioned and committed with a speed that suggested the defending commander had anticipated the axis of attack. Patton had not anticipated the specific axis. He had simply positioned his reserves where the terrain logic suggested the most dangerous German option would come from. It was the same skill he had applied at Verdun when he looked at the German breakthrough as a shape rather than a disaster. Terrain told him where the enemy would go, because terrain limits options and limited options become predictions. The defeat of the January 3rd German counterattack did not end the Battle of the Bulge. Fighting continued for weeks, grinding and costly, as Allied forces pressed the German salient from both north and south, compressing the Bulge back toward the German frontier. But the January 3rd failure marked the point at which German offensive capability in the Ardennes was exhausted. After that attack, Model had no more reserve divisions to commit, no more armored strength to concentrate. The initiative passed permanently to the Allies, and it never returned to German hands in the West. The numbers from the Bastogne operation, compiled in the weeks after the fighting stabilized, told a story that strategic analysts would study for decades. Third Army had moved 250,000 men, an average of 100 miles in 6 days, under winter conditions that military doctrine classified as severely limiting for large-scale maneuver. The 4th Armored Division had sustained 35% tank losses while advancing 40 miles against prepared defenses, and then successfully defending the penetration against 9 German counterattacks over 8 days. The Bastogne corridor, which German commanders had predicted would be closed within 48 hours of its opening, remained open, widened, and reinforced. The 101st Airborne Division, which had held the Bastogne perimeter for 7 days, surrounded and besieged, suffered approximately 3,000 casualties during the siege, but inflicted losses on attacking German forces that American analysts estimated at more than 8,000 killed, wounded, and captured. The defenders had held at odds of better than 3-1, without adequate ammunition, without air support for most of the siege, and without the knowledge of whether relief was actually coming. Eisenhower visited Bastogne on January 14, 1945. He awarded decorations. He stood for photographs in the ruined town with the commanders whose decisions had shaped the battle. McAuliffe received recognition for the defense. Patton stood in the cold and deflected credit with characteristic indirection, suggesting the paratroopers had managed perfectly well and Third Army had simply opened a door for them. The paratroopers bristled at this characterization, as they always would, because their pride in the siege was real and hard-earned. But after the ceremony, away from the cameras and the formal language of military recognition, Bradley pulled Patton aside. What he said then, recorded in Patton's diary and later confirmed in Bradley's own reflections, was not the measured acknowledgement of a superior to a subordinate. It was the statement of one professional to another, unguarded, specific, and carrying the weight of genuine conviction. Bradley told him that Third Army's response at Bastogne was the most brilliant operation of the war. He said historians would study it for generations. Those words, coming from Omar Bradley, a man whose natural register was understatement and whose professional habit was caution, were as close to awe as his character allowed. They were the private truth beneath the public ceremony. The recognition that mattered more than the photographs, more than the decorations, more than the newspaper coverage, that would eventually reduce 7 days of desperate fighting to a headline and a date. But here is what most accounts of Bastogne leave out entirely. The man who made that operation possible, who spent the night of December 18th ordering plans that had not been authorized, who stood in the cold room at Verdun and promised the impossible, who drove his army north and refused to slow down when slowing down was reasonable and logical, and defensible, went back to fighting the next day. No pause, no celebration. Third Army had a war to finish, and Patton intended to finish it. What happened to him in the months between Bastogne and Germany's surrender, what the operation cost him personally, and what Bradley truly believed about the man he had protected through scandal and controversy and professional exile, is a story that the history books have told in fragments. The complete picture, the final accounting of what Bastogne meant for Patton's career, his reputation, and his complicated relationship with the commanders who needed him but never entirely trusted him, is what Part 4 is about. Because the most important thing Bradley ever said about George Patton was not what he said at Bastogne. It was what he said after the war was over, and almost no one has heard it. George Patton turned 250,000 men 90 degrees in 48 hours, drove them north through winter, and fire-cracked open the siege of Bastogne, and then defeated 9 German counterattacks in 8 days to hold what he had gained. Third Army's operation became the standard by which large-scale armored maneuver would be measured for the rest of the 20th century. Bradley called it the most brilliant operation of the war, and Part 3 ended with a question that the battle itself never answered. What happened to the man who made it possible? Because the story of George Patton after Bastogne is not the story most people expect. It is stranger, sadder, and ultimately more revealing than the legend. The twist that almost no one knows is this: the man who saved the 101st Airborne, who kept the promise that the entire Allied command believed was impossible, who earned from Bradley the highest professional praise one general ever gave another, never saw the end of the war. He won. George Smith Patton died on December 21st, 1945, exactly 1 year and 5 days after his tanks first reached Bastogne. The circumstances were almost absurdly ordinary for a man who had spent his life seeking extraordinary deaths. Not a bullet, not a shell, not the kind of end that a warrior of his temperament would have chosen or deserved. A traffic accident outside Mannheim, Germany. A collision between his staff car and an American Army truck on a road he had traveled dozens of times. The impact threw him forward and broke his neck at the 3rd and 4th cervical vertebrae. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down. He lived for 12 days in a military hospital in Heidelberg, lucid aware of his condition and characteristically direct about his prognosis. He told his wife Beatrice, who flew from the United States to be with him, that he did not think a man could live with a broken neck and a body that could no longer move. He was correct. He died on December 21st, 1945, of pulmonary edema, his lungs filling with fluid while his body remained motionless. He was 60 years old. The war in Europe had been over for 7 months. There is a particular cruelty in that timing that military historians have noted but never quite adequately described. Patton spent the final months of the war fighting not German armor but American bureaucracy. He wanted to continue east after Germany surrendered. He believed with a strategic clarity that subsequent history would partially vindicate that the Soviet Union represented the next serious threat to European stability, and that the Allied armies then in the field were the instrument best positioned to address it. He said so publicly and without diplomatic softening at a press conference in September 1945. Eisenhower relieved him of command of Third Army within weeks. He was given a largely ceremonial posting overseeing the writing of military histories. For a man who had commanded 250,000 soldiers in the most dynamic armored campaign in the history of warfare, the assignment was not a job. It was a waiting room. He hated it with a completeness that the people around him could feel. He wrote letters to Beatrice that described the experience of peacetime soldiering with barely concealed anguish. He had been built for war, had spent his entire professional life preparing for it, and had been extraordinarily good at it precisely when it mattered most. Now the war was over, and the machine he represented had no purpose left that matched its design. He was planning a trip home to the United States, intending to resign his commission and write his memoirs when the accident happened. He never made it home. Beatrice Patton brought his body back to Luxembourg and buried him at the American Military Cemetery at Ham among the soldiers of Third Army. He had requested this specifically. He wanted to lie with his men. The grave is marked like every other grave in that cemetery, a white cross identical to the 11,000 others surrounding it, different only in the name and the rank. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had spoken in terms of weeks at Verdun, while Patton spoke in hours, attended the funeral. Whatever Montgomery thought of Patton in life, he understood in death what the man had represented, and paid his respects accordingly. Omar Bradley outlived Patton by 36 years. He died in 1981 at the age of 88, the last of the great American field commanders of World War II. In the decades between Bastogne and his own death, Bradley returned repeatedly in his writing and his speeches to that week in December 1944, and his assessment never softened or qualified itself into diplomatic ambiguity. He believed to the end of his life that Third Army's response at Bastogne was the finest example of large-scale armored maneuver in the history of the United States Army. He wrote in his memoirs that Patton's flaws were real and well documented, and that none of them changed the fundamental truth that when the situation was most desperate and the stakes were highest, Patton delivered results that no other commander in the Allied order of battle could have produced on the same timeline. That judgment from the most measured and careful senior American commander of the war is the true monument to what happened at Bastogne. Not the photographs, not the decorations, not the Hollywood film that would dramatize the battle for subsequent generations. Bradley's private acknowledgment offered without ceremony in a ruined Belgian town in January 1945 carries more weight than any of it, because Bradley did not offer praise carelessly, and everyone who knew him understood that. The operational lessons of Third Army's pivot became foundational to American military doctrine in ways that shaped every large-scale armored operation for the remainder of the 20th century. The concept of maintaining multiple contingency plans simultaneously, which Patton demonstrated on the night of December 18th, when he ordered his staff to prepare 3 different attack options before any attack had been authorized, became standard practice in American Corps and Army-level planning. The emphasis on momentum over positional security, the willingness to accept exposed flanks in exchange for operational tempo. The understanding that speed itself can be a form of protection, because a fast-moving force presents a more difficult targeting problem than a static one. These principles were absorbed into the doctrine that American forces carried into Korea, into the planning for potential conflict in Central Europe during the Cold War, and eventually into the operational concepts that produced the 100-hour ground campaign of the Gulf War in 1991. Norman Schwarzkopf, commanding coalition forces in Desert Storm, studied the Bastogne operation extensively during his preparation for the campaign against Iraq. The famous left hook through the western desert, the wide envelopment that bypassed Iraqi strength and struck the Republican Guard from an unexpected direction, drew on precisely the understanding of tempo and operational surprise that Patton had demonstrated 46 years earlier. The specific tactical circumstances were entirely different. The underlying principle was identical. Move faster than the enemy can respond. Strike from the direction he has not prepared for. Keep him reacting rather than acting. The broader lesson that Bastogne teaches, the one that extends beyond military history into any organization facing a crisis that exceeds its existing doctrine, is about the relationship between preparation and improvisation. Patton's achievement at Bastogne was not improvisation. It looked like improvisation from the outside, from the perspective of the commanders in that cold room at Verdun, who heard a promise that seemed disconnected from operational reality. But what appeared to be improvisation was actually preparation responding to opportunity. Patton had trained Third Army to move fast. He had built a staff that could generate plans under pressure. He had selected commanders who understood that arriving imperfectly and on time was worth more than arriving perfectly and late. None of that was improvised on December 18th. It was the accumulated result of months of deliberate effort that suddenly found exactly the situation it had been built to address. This is the lesson that institutions consistently fail to learn and consistently pay for when crisis arrives. The organizations that respond effectively to unexpected challenges are almost never the ones that improvise best under pressure. They are the ones that prepared most deliberately for the kind of pressure that preparation cannot fully anticipate. Patton did not know on November 1st, 1944, that he would need to turn Third Army 90 degrees in 48 hours in December. He knew that war creates situations that exceed existing plans, and he built an organization designed to function when plans became inadequate. That is a different kind of preparation, rarer and more valuable than the kind that simply anticipates known problems. The detail that most accounts of Bastogne omit, the one that changes the texture of the story in a way that no operational summary captures, is what Patton wrote in his diary on the night of December 26, 1944, after receiving confirmation that his tanks had reached the Bastogne perimeter. He did not write about the operational achievement. He did not record his feelings about being vindicated in front of the Allied High Command that had laughed at his promise 7 days earlier. He wrote about the soldiers. He wrote that he hoped the men who had been inside Bastogne had enough to eat, that he worried about the ones who had been wounded and waiting for evacuation, that he wanted the supply convoys moving as fast as possible through the corridor so that the paratroopers could have a meal on Christmas night, even though Christmas had technically already passed. Then he wrote one sentence that his biographers have quoted more than any other passage from his private papers. He wrote that he did not think he had done anything particularly impressive, because the men who held Bastogne for 7 days, surrounded and outnumbered and undersupplied, had done the thing that could not be replaced or replicated or ordered by any general, regardless of his operational genius. They had simply refused to quit. Everything he had done, all the planning and the speed and the pivot and the fighting through German defenses, had been in service of that refusal. The general's job, he wrote, was to make sure that kind of courage was not wasted. From a freezing conference room in Verdun, where the most powerful Allied commanders in Europe were speaking in terms of weeks and months, to a corridor of road cut through German defenses by a column of Sherman tanks, charging straight up a road into direct fire, to a diary entry written by a general who believed the real heroes were the men he had come to relieve. The story of Bastogne is ultimately not a story about military genius, though genius was present. It is a story about what happens when preparation meets urgency, when courage on one end of a corridor is matched by relentless movement on the other, and when a man makes a promise in a room full of doubt and then goes out and keeps it. Third Army covered more than 100 miles in 6 days in the worst winter in a generation. The 101st Airborne held for 7 days against an enemy 4 times their number. Together, those two facts destroyed the last serious German offensive of the Second World War in the West, and saved, by the most conservative estimates, the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers on both sides, who would have died in the weeks of continued fighting that a successful German breakthrough would have required. If you have spent time with this story and found something in it worth carrying forward, the comment section is exactly the right place to put it. There are hundreds of stories from the Second World War at this scale of detail and this level of human complexity, most of them untold or undertold, waiting in archives and diaries and after-action reports for someone willing to read carefully enough to find what matters. George Patton spent his life preparing for wars he hoped would never come and fighting them brilliantly when they did. He died in peacetime in a traffic accident before he could go home. He is buried in Luxembourg, among the soldiers he commanded, under a cross identical to the ones marking the graves of the men who followed him. That is the ending he chose for himself when he could have chosen otherwise. And that choice, more than the operational brilliance, more than the speed, more than the promise kept in a cold room in Verdun, is the truest measure of the man. Because the generals who matter are not the ones who seek glory. They are the ones who understand, in the quiet of a diary written after the battle, that the glory was never theirs to begin with.